When a human from Earth dares to stand tall before the powerful queen of an empire, refusing to kneel while the entire galaxy watches, will he survive the defiance, or will he be crushed by destiny? If you're enjoying this epic story of defiance and cosmic intrigue, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and leave a comment below to let us know your thoughts. Don't forget to ring the bell to stay updated on all our thrilling new episodes. The Galactic Hall erupted in a symphony of light and sound, a cathedral of cosmic grandeur where starlight poured through a crystalline dome, fracturing into prisms that danced across walls veined with molten cobalt. The air hummed with the low thrum of gravitic generators, vibrating through the obsidian floor as 1,000 ambassadors, draped in silks that shimmered like liquid auroras and armor forged from asteroid cores, prepared for the arrival of their leader. Suddenly, a pulse of energy rippled through the chamber, and the ceremonial blades, clutched by stoic guards, clashed against the ground in perfect unison, their metallic song slicing the silence. The crowd dropped to their knees, heads bowed, breaths held, as if the very stars had paused to witness her. Zinnia, sovereign of the Terith Alliance, emerged from a veil of holographic mist, her silhouette a vision of power and allure. Her lavender skin gleamed like polished amethyst under the dome's radiance, each step sending ripples of light across her form-fitting bodysuit, which clung to her like a lover's embrace, tracing the elegant curve of her waist and the strength of her thighs. Her raven hair, unbound, flowed like a dark comet's tail, and her golden eyes burned with the intensity of twin suns, commanding every soul in the room. The air grew heavy, charged with her presence, as if gravity itself bent to her will. But one figure defied the tide. Elias Kane, Earth's rogue ambassador, leaned against a pillar at the hall's edge, his leather jacket scuffed from a dozen worlds, his dark hair falling in reckless waves over a brow etched with defiance. His green eyes, sharp and unyielding, tracked Zinnia's approach, unbowed by the weight of tradition. He twirled a protein stick between his fingers, the casual motion a stark rebellion against the chamber's rigid choreography. As the crowd knelt, their robes pooling like molten silver, Elias remained upright, his broad shoulders squared, his lips curling into a half-smile that was equal parts challenge and charm. The guards' plasma lances hummed, their tips glowing with menace. But Elias didn't flinch, his pulse quickening not from fear, but from the thrill of the moment. Zinnia's gaze snapped to him, a predator locking onto prey. Yet her eyes held a flicker of something else, curiosity, perhaps, or the spark of a fire yet to ignite. She glided forward, her boots silent on the polished floor, each step a deliberate dance that made the light play across her lavender skin, highlighting the delicate hollow of her throat, the subtle curve of her collarbone. The hall seemed to shrink, the crowd fading into a blur of shadows, leaving only the two of them in a charged orbit. "You," she said, her voice a low, resonant melody that vibrated through Elias's chest, each word laced with a heat that made his skin prickle. "You do not kneel." Elias tilted his head, his smile widening as he took a deliberate bite of the protein stick, chewing slowly, savoring the tension. "Kneeling's overrated," he replied, his voice a gravelly drawl that cut through the silence like a laser. "Messes with my flow. And you, lady, are way too gorgeous for me to be staring at the floor." A collective gasp rippled through the ambassadors, their whispers a storm of scandal. The guards surged, lances flaring, but Zinnia's hand shot up, her slender fingers adorned with rings that pulsed like miniature nebulae. The guards froze, their weapons lowering, but the air crackled with the threat of violence. Zinnia stepped closer, her presence a tidal force, her golden eyes narrowing as they traced Elias's form. The rugged lines of his jaw, the casual strength in his stance, the insolent spark in his gaze. Her lavender skin shimmered, catching the starlight in a way that made Elias's breath catch, a primal urge stirring in his core. "Bold words, Earthman," she murmured, her voice dropping to a sultry whisper, each syllable a challenge wrapped in velvet. "Do you know the price of such defiance?" Elias leaned forward, closing the distance until he could feel the warmth radiating from her, the faint scent of star bloom and spice flooding his senses. His heart pounded, but his smile never wavered. "Price? I'm betting it's worth it," he said, his eyes locked on hers, a roguish glint dancing in their depths. "Besides, I need my knees for more entertaining pursuits." The hall seemed to hold its breath, the tension a tangible force that pressed against the walls. Zinnia's lips parted, a ghost of a smile curving them, as dangerous as a supernova and twice as alluring. Her gaze lingered, sliding over his broad chest, the worn leather of his jacket, as if mapping every inch of him. For a fleeting moment, the world narrowed to the space between them, a battlefield of desire and defiance where neither would yield. "You intrigue me," she said, her voice a low purr that sent a shiver racing down Elias's spine. A dangerous trait in a man. "Danger's my specialty," Elias shot back, his grin sharpening. "Stick around, and I'll show you how it's done." A murmur of shock rolled through the crowd, but Zinnia's smile widened, a rare crack in her regal facade that sent a thrill through Elias's veins. She raised a hand, her gesture commanding silence, her eyes never leaving his. "Let him stand," she declared, her voice ringing with finality, echoing off the crystalline walls like a decree from the stars themselves. The guards stepped back, their lances dimming, but the ambassador's whispers grew into a storm, their eyes darting between Zinnia and the insolent human. Zinnia turned, her hair swaying like a dark tide, and glided toward her throne, a platform of translucent crystal that pulsed with inner light. Each step was a performance, her body a symphony of grace and power, her lavender skin catching the starlight in a way that made Elias's blood surge. She paused at the throne's edge, casting a final glance over her shoulder, her golden eyes smoldering with a promise that set his nerves alight. Elias exhaled, his heart hammering, the heat of her gaze still searing his skin. He just stared down the ruler of a galactic empire, defied centuries of tradition, and sparked something undeniable in her eyes. The game had begun, and he was all in. As the hall settled, the ambassadors rising with murmurs of disbelief, Elias popped the rest of the protein stick into his mouth, his grin unshakable. "Well," he muttered to himself, his voice a low rumble, "this is going to be one hell of a ride." Elias Kane hurled a wrench skyward, the tool spinning through the air like a rogue comet before it clanged against the underside of a floating Tereth platform, sending a shower of luminescent pollen cascading down. The floating garden aboard the Tereth mothership was a living tapestry, its air thick with the hum of crystalline bees and the glow of vines that pulsed like veins of a sleeping giant. Petals of translucent azure drifted lazily, catching the light of bioluminescent orbs that hovered like miniature moons. Elias, sprawled on his back beneath the platform, cursed under his breath, his leather jacket splayed open, revealing a sweat-dampened shirt that clung to the hard ridges of his torso. His fingers, smudged with alien grease, wrestled with a tangle of wires, his green eyes narrowed in defiance of the platform's incomprehensible design. "Damn thing's mocking me," he muttered, his voice a low growl that echoed faintly in the verdant expanse. He yanked a wire, and a pulse of violet light flared, bathing his rugged features in an otherworldly glow. The garden seemed to respond, its vines shivering, as if amused by his audacity. A soft rustle broke his focus, like the whisper of silk against skin. Elias froze, his senses sharpening, the air suddenly heavier with a scent, wild, floral, and edged with something dangerously intoxicating. He slid out from under the platform, his muscles flexing as he rose, wiping sweat from his brow with a forearm corded with strength. His shirt, rolled to the elbows, revealed scars from forgotten battles, each mark a testament to a life lived on the edge. Zinnia stood at the garden's heart, framed by an arch of glowing fronds that curled like lovers' fingers. Her lavender skin shimmered, catching the orb's light in a way that made her seem carved from starlit amethyst. Her tunic, a masterpiece of Tereth craftsmanship, hugged her form, accentuating the gentle swell of her hips and the taut elegance of her waist. Her raven hair cascaded over one shoulder, framing the delicate curve of her neck, and her golden eyes, molten and piercing, locked onto Elias with a hunger that made his pulse race. She moved toward him, each step a deliberate seduction, the vines parting as if bowing to her will. "Tampering with my ship, Earthman." Her voice was a velvet blade, smooth and teasing, each word curling around his senses like smoke, sending a jolt through his veins. Elias grinned, brushing dirt from his hands, his shirt tightening across his chest as he stepped closer, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her. "Not tampering," he said, his voice a husky drawl, eyes glinting with mischief. "Just giving some Earth swagger. Call it cosmic flirtation. You into it?" Zinnia's lips parted, a flicker of amusement dancing in her eyes. But there was something deeper, a spark of curiosity, a crack in her regal armor. She tilted her head, her hair sliding across her shoulder, exposing the silken expanse of her throat, a sight that made Elias's breath hitch. The air between them thickened, a charged current that buzzed against his skin, as if the garden itself was conspiring to draw them closer. "Flirtation is a dangerous game," she murmured, her voice dropping to a sultry whisper, each syllable a challenge that stirred something primal in him. "Especially with one so reckless." Elias chuckled, his gaze sliding to her lips, full and inviting, before snapping back to her eyes. "Reckless is my brand," he said, leaning in, his voice a low rumble. "Ever tasted it? Or were you too busy ruling the galaxy to take a sip?" She didn't retreat, her breath catching, a faint tremor in her lavender skin betraying the storm beneath her composure. The orbs above dimmed, casting their bodies in a soft violet glow, the garden's hum fading to a distant pulse. Zinnia's eyes narrowed, but her lips curved, a dangerous smile that sent a shiver racing down Elias's spine. "I am the Alliance's heart," she said, her voice wavering, a confession wrapped in defiance. "Desire is a luxury I cannot afford." Elias's hand brushed hers, a fleeting touch that ignited a spark, her skin warm and silken under his calloused fingers. He felt her tremble, a subtle quake that echoed in his chest, and he held her gaze, unflinching. "Desire's not a luxury, Zinnia," he said softly, his voice a gravelly promise. "It's the spark that keeps you burning." Her golden eyes widened, a tempest of want and restraint swirling within them, her fingers lingering against his, the contact a silent surrender. The garden seemed to hold its breath, the vines stilling, the bees pausing their dance, as if the universe itself was caught in their orbit. Elias's heart pounded, the heat of her touch searing his skin, her scent flooding his senses like a drug. For a moment, they stood frozen, their bodies painted in hues of violet and gold, the air crackling with unspoken promises. "Zinnia!" A guard's voice shattered the spell, sharp and urgent, slicing through the haze like a blade. "Clyro's rebels are arming ships. The council demands you." Zinnia's hand slipped from his, her composure snapping into place like a shield, but her eyes lingered, molten and fierce, a vow etched in their depths. "This conversation isn't over, Earthman," she said, her voice a sultry command, each word a thread tying them together. She turned, her tunic catching the light, outlining the graceful arc of her spine as she glided toward the archway, the vines curling in her wake. Elias watched, his body humming with the memory of her touch, the air still heavy with her scent. He ran a hand through his hair, his grin unshakable, a fire kindling in his chest. "Damn," he muttered, his voice a low rumble, eyes tracing the path she'd taken. "She's going to be the death of me." He bent to retrieve his wrench, the garden's glow pulsing around him, but his mind was elsewhere, caught in the orbit of a woman whose lavender skin and golden eyes promised a dance far more dangerous than any rebellion. The Clyros could wait. Zinnia was a challenge he couldn't resist, and he was ready to play. Elias Kane spun a glowing Terith goblet on his finger like a rogue planet. its crystalline surface refracting beams of emerald light that skittered across the banquet hall's polished quartz floor. The chamber was a celestial marvel, its vaulted ceiling a living mosaic of holographic constellations, their orbits weaving ribbons of sapphire and gold that bathed the room in a dreamlike glow. Tables of translucent obsidian groaned under platters of bioluminescent delicacies, their aromas sweet, spicy, and alien, curling through the air like tendrils of a forgotten nebula. Ambassadors, draped in robes that shimmered like liquid starfire and armor etched with pulsar patterns, moved in a choreographed ballet of protocol, their voices a low hum of diplomacy. Elias, however, was a supernova in their midst, his presence a glorious disruption. His Terith suit, a reluctant concession to decorum, was a shade too tight, molding to his muscular frame like a second skin, accentuating the broad sweep of his shoulders and the lean power of his hips. A leather belt, slung low like a gunslinger's, added a defiant earth edge, its buckle catching the light with every swaggering step. He tossed the goblet upward, catching it mid-air with a grin, but his flourish sent a tray of glowing orbs, each pulsing with inner light, crashing to the floor, their radiance scattering like a swarm of fireflies. Oops! Elias's laugh boomed, unapologetic and raw, slicing through the hall's decorum like a plasma blade. Guess these snacks are ready to party. Heads turned, ambassadors gasping, their jeweled masks glinting with disapproval. Across the hall, at a raised dais of frosted crystal, Zinnia presided, her lavender skin aglow under a diaphanous gown that clung to her curves like mist to a mountain. The fabric, woven from star thread, shimmered with every breath, revealing glimpses of her toned arms and the elegant arc of her collarbone. Her raven hair was swept up, exposing the silken expanse of her neck, and her golden eyes, molten and fierce, locked onto Elias, a spark of delight flickering in their depths. She raised a chalice to her lips, hiding a smile, but her gaze was a gravitational pull, tugging him closer. Elias sauntered to his assigned seat, plopping down beside General Vorix, a Terith warlord whose obsidian scales gleamed like polished midnight, his eyes narrowing to slits of contempt. The general's bulk dwarfed the table, his clawed hand crushing a goblet as he sneered. "Earth," he rumbled, his voice a seismic growl, a cesspit of disorder and frail flesh. Elias leaned back, his grin sharp as a comet's edge, one hand casually twirling a fork. "Cesspits make damn fine bourbon, General," he shot back, his voice a lazy drawl that carried across the table. "And disorder? That's just a warm-up for something explosive." He glanced at Zinnia, his tone dropping to a husky murmur, eyes glinting with mischief. "Ever felt an explosion, Zinnia? Or you prefer sipping starlight?" Her lips parted, a flush blooming across her lavender cheeks, her skin glowing like a newborn star. The table fell silent, ambassadors freezing mid-sip, their eyes darting to their leader. Zinnia's laugh, soft, unguarded, like the chime of distant bells, rang out, shattering the tension. Vorix choked on his drink, scales rattling, while Elias winked, his heart racing at the sight of her unraveling, her composure fraying under his gaze. "You tread a perilous line, Earthman," Zinnia said, her voice a sultry melody, each word laced with a challenge that sent a shiver down Elias's spine. Her fingers traced the rim of her chalice, a slow, deliberate motion that drew his eyes, her lavender skin catching the holographic light in a way that made his blood surge. "Peril's my playground," Elias replied, leaning forward, his grin unshakable. "Care to join me for a spin?" The ambassadors gasped, but Zinnia's eyes narrowed, a dangerous smile curving her lips, her gaze sliding over his taut frame, lingering on the way his suit hugged his chest. The air crackled, charged with a tension that pulsed like a star about to ignite. For a moment, the hall faded, the constellations above dimming, leaving only the heat of their shared defiance. Later, as the banquet dissolved into murmurs and clinking glass, Elias slipped into a shadowed corridor, its walls framed by a panoramic view of a swirling nebula, its violet and crimson tides churning like a lover's embrace. He leaned against the viewport, the cool surface a stark contrast to the fire in his veins, when a rustle of star thread announced her presence. Zinnia emerged from the shadows, her gown shimmering, each step a silent seduction that made the nebula pale in comparison. She stopped inches away, her breath a warm whisper against his skin, her fingers grazing his chest, sending a jolt through his body. "You unravel me," she murmured, her voice a raw confession, her golden eyes burning with a need that mirrored his own. Her lavender skin glowed, every curve an invitation, her scent, wild and intoxicating, flooding his senses. Elias caught her hand, his thumb tracing slow circles on her wrist, feeling her pulse race beneath her silken skin. "Unraveling's just the start, Zinnia," he said, his voice a low growl, lips hovering near hers, the air between them electric. "Let me show you what comes next." Her body swayed toward him, her lavender skin catching the nebula's light, her breath hitching as their lips brushed, a fleeting spark that set his nerves alight. The corridor seemed to spin, the stars outside blurring, as if the universe itself was caught in their orbit. But a klaxon's wail tore through the moment, harsh and urgent, a voice crackling through the comms. Clyro's warships detected at the border. "All hands to stations." Zinnia pulled back, her eyes still locked on Elias, a smoldering promise in their depths. "This dance isn't finished," she vowed, her voice a sultry command, each word a thread binding them tighter. She turned, her gown trailing like a comet's tail, and strode toward the command deck, her lavender skin aglow with purpose. Elias watched, his body humming with the memory of her touch, his grin unshakable. "Damn," he muttered, running a hand through his hair, eyes tracing her retreating form. "She's gonna burn me alive." He pushed off the viewport, the nebula's light painting his silhouette, and followed her path, the fire in his chest roaring louder than any warship. The Clyros could bring their fleets. Elias was ready for a different kind of battle, one where desire was the ultimate weapon. Elias Kane kicked open the strategy chamber's door with a booted foot, the heavy panel of translucent alloy swinging wide as he balanced a steaming mug of earth coffee in one hand, its aroma cutting through the sterile air like a rebel's anthem. The chamber was a crucible of light, its walls a frenetic canvas of holographic starships spiraling in mock battles, their trajectories weaving a chaotic tapestry of crimson and azure. Consoles pulsed with data streams, their hum a relentless heartbeat, while the floor, polished to a mirror sheen, reflected the flickering chaos above. Tereth counselors, clad in robes that shimmered like molten comets, stood in rigid formation, their faces etched with the weight of impending war. At the room's heart, a circular platform glowed, its surface alive with projections of Clyro's fleets massing at the border. Zinnia commanded the platform, her lavender skin radiant under the harsh glow of a hovering luminary, its light carving shadows across her form-fitting armor. The suit, a masterpiece of function and allure, traced the lithe strength of her limbs, accentuating the curve of her spine and the subtle power in her stance. Her raven hair was bound in a tight coil, a stark contrast to her golden eyes, which burned with a steely resolve tempered by a flicker of unrest. She gestured, and a hologram flared, depicting Clyro's warships, sleek, predatory, poised to strike. The air crackled with tension, the counselor's murmurs a low storm. Elias strode in, his leather jacket slung over one shoulder, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, revealing a glimpse of tanned skin and the hard edge of his collarbone. His green eyes glinted with mischief, undaunted by the chamber's gravity. He took a sip of coffee, misjudged a step, and stumbled into a console, the mug's contents splashing across its surface in a dark arc. Sparks hissed, and a hologram flickered, drawing sharp glares from the counselors. "Whoops!" Elias grinned, wiping the console with his sleeve, his voice a lazy drawl that echoed in the sterile space. Hope that didn't just launch a fleet. Or charm you too much, Zinnia. Her golden eyes snapped to him, a spark of amusement breaking through her armor of command. Her lips twitched, her lavender skin catching the luminary's light in a way that made it shimmer like a distant nebula, highlighting the delicate curve of her jaw. She stepped down from the platform, her boots clicking softly, each movement a study in controlled grace that sent a pulse of heat through Elias's veins. "Mind your step, Earthman," she said, her voice a silken tease, laced with a warmth that belied her stern gaze. "Or you'll ignite more than circuits." Elias leaned against the console, his grin widening, the scent of coffee mingling with the faint musk of his exertion. "Ignition's my specialty," he shot back, eyes locked on hers, a roguish glint dancing in their depths. "You feeling the heat yet?" A counselor cleared their throat, shattering the moment, their voice droning about Clyros's aggression, plasma barges, blockades, annihilation. The holograms shifted, warships clashing in silent fury, their light casting stark shadows across Zinnia's face. She raised a hand, silencing the room, but her eyes lingered on Elias, a silent challenge sparking between them. Elias raised his mug, his voice cutting through the din like a beacon. "War's a snooze," he said, stepping forward, his presence a defiant blaze in the chamber's cold precision. "Why blast them when we can dazzle them? Throw a nebulous summit at the border. Music that shakes the stars, lights that blind, dances that make pulses race. They'll be too busy joining the party to fire a shot." The council erupted, voices clashing like colliding asteroids, their protests a cacophony of disbelief. "Madness," one cried. "Treachery," barked another. But Zinnia's gaze never wavered, her fingers curling around the platform's edge, her body tilting toward Elias as if drawn by an unseen force. Her lavender skin flushed, a subtle warmth that made Elias's breath catch, her eyes blazing with a wild curiosity. "You'd sway an enemy with revelry?" she asked, her voice a sultry challenge, each word a thread weaving them closer. Her hair, loosened slightly, grazed her cheek, a dark contrast to her glowing skin. Elias stepped onto the platform, closing the distance, his boots scuffing the glowing surface. "Revelry's just the start," he murmured, his voice a husky promise, eyes tracing the curve of her lips. "Imagine them disarmed, not by guns but by wanting something more alive." Her breath hitched, her lavender skin shimmering, the air between them electric, charged with a hunger that pulsed like a star's core. The counselors faded, their protests a distant hum, as Zinnia's fingers tapped the platform, a restless rhythm that mirrored Elias's racing pulse. "Prepare the summit," she commanded, her voice firm but laced with a tremor of excitement. "You're with me, Earthman." The counselors gasped, but Zinnia's eyes held Elias, a promise smoldering in their golden depths. The chamber dissolved into murmurs, but Elias felt only the heat of her gaze, the weight of her words binding them in a dance yet to unfold. Later, on a secluded observation deck, the stars beyond the viewport burned with a fierce, untamed light, their glow painting the room in hues of violet and silver. Elias leaned against a railing, his shirt open at the chest, the cool air kissing his skin. Zinnia appeared, her armor shed for a lighter tunic that hugged her form, revealing the soft curve of her shoulders and the strength of her arms. She stopped close, her hip brushing his, her scent, star bloom and molten spice, flooding his senses. "You make me doubt my own stars," she whispered, her fingers grazing his jaw, a touch that sent a jolt through his body, her lavender skin warm against his stubble. Elias caught her wrist, his thumb tracing her pulse, feeling it race beneath her silken skin. "Doubt's a gateway, Zinnia," he murmured, his lips a breath from hers, the air crackling with unspoken need. "Step through, and I'll show you fire." Her golden eyes flared, her body swaying toward him, her lavender skin glowing like a beacon in the starlight. The deck seemed to spin, the stars blurring, as their breaths mingled, a fleeting promise of something untamed. But a calm buzzed, sharp and insistent, a voice crackling through. Clyro's scouts detected near the summit site. Zinnia pulled back, her eyes still locked on Elias, a vow etched in their depths. "We'll finish this," she said, her voice a sultry command, and turned, her tunic catching the starlight as she strode away. Elias exhaled, his body humming, his grin unshakable. "Hell yeah, we will," he muttered, eyes tracing her retreating form, the fire in his chest roaring louder than any war. The Clyros could scheme. He was ready for a different kind of conquest. Elias Kane vaulted over a railing onto the Nebula Summit's central platform, landing with a roguish flourish that sent a ripple of light across the border station's translucent floor, its surface shimmering like a frozen galaxy. The station was a marvel suspended in the void, its walls of crystalline polymer framing a maelstrom of violet and amber nebulae that churned beyond, their tides casting prismatic glows across the revelry. Drones wove through the air, trailing beams of silver and crimson that pulsed in sync with a music unlike any other, a raw, earthy growl of earth guitars braided with Teretha's crystalline chimes, the sound vibrating through the bones of every guest. Tables laden with glowing fruits and steaming liquors lined the edges, their scents, tart, smoky, and alien, mingling with the electric buzz of anticipation. Elias stood tall, his tailored Tereth suit a sleek betrayal of his rugged roots, its dark fabric clinging to his muscular frame, accentuating the broad sweep of his chest and the lean strength of his thighs. A single leather cord, knotted at his waist, was his nod to earth, catching the light with every swaggering step. His green eyes scanned the crowd, ambassadors in robes of liquid starlight, Tereth nobles with gem-encrusted masks, but they settled on one figure, drawn like a comet to a star. Zinnia glided through the throng, her lavender skin luminous under a gown of gossamer filaments, each thread shimmering as if woven from the nebula itself. The fabric hugged her curves, tracing the elegant arc of her hips and the taut grace of her shoulders, left bare to glow like polished amethyst. Her raven hair tumbled free, a cascade of midnight that swayed with her steps, and her golden eyes, fierce and molten, locked onto Elias, a hunger in their depths that made his pulse thunder. She moved with a predator's grace, the crowd parting before her, her presence a gravitational force that bent the room's energy to her will. "You're late to your own party, Earthman," she said, her voice a sultry dare, each word curling around his senses like a lover's whisper, sending a jolt through his veins. Elias grinned, closing the distance in a single stride, his boots scuffing the glowing floor. "How to make an entrance?" he shot back, his voice a husky drawl, eyes glinting with mischief. "Ready to steal the show with me, Zinnia?" Her lips curved, a dangerous smile that sparked a fire in his chest, her lavender skin catching the drone light in a way that made her seem lit from within, highlighting the soft curve of her throat. She stepped closer, her scent, wild star bloom and molten amber, flooding his senses, and extended a hand. "Dance with me," she murmured, her voice a velvet command. "If you can keep up." Elias took her hand, his fingers brushing her silken skin, a spark igniting at the contact that raced up his arm. He pulled her close, his other hand settling on the curve of her hip, feeling the warmth of her through the gossamer fabric. "Careful, gorgeous," he whispered, his lips grazing her ear, his breath stirring her hair. "This dance might burn the stars down." They moved as one, her body molding against his, her curves pressing into his chest, their breaths sinking to a rhythm that drowned out the music. The floor pulsed beneath them, the drone's lights swirling in a frenzy, painting their forms in hues of violet and gold. Zinnia's fingers trailed up his arm, a silent plea that frayed his control, her lavender skin glowing under his touch, each movement a symphony of desire. The crowd blurred, the universe narrowing to the heat between them, a dance that felt like a vow, a challenge, a surrender. A ripple of tension broke their orbit as the Clyros delegation stormed in, led by Warlord Drake, his metallic wings glinting like razors, his eyes cold with suspicion. The music faltered, guests freezing, but Elias stepped forward, a shimmering medallion in hand, its surface etched with Tarith runes. "Warlord," he called, his voice steady, a grin curling his lips. "Welcome to the summit. We don't clash here, we connect. Care to join the vibe?" Drake's wings twitched, his gaze narrowing, but Zinnia's voice rang out, rich and commanding, cutting through the silence. "The Alliance seeks unity, not war," she said, her lavender skin radiant, her eyes flicking to Elias, a shared secret in their depths. "Stand with us, Drake." The warlord hesitated, his warriors shifting, but Elias tossed the medallion, catching Drake's eye. "Party's better than a fight," he added, his tone light but firm. "Trust me." Drake caught the medallion, his expression softening, and nodded, his warriors lowering their blades. The music surged, the summit erupting into cheers, and Elias exchanged a glance with Zinnia, her smile a quiet triumph that set his heart racing. Later, in a secluded alcove carved into the station's wall, the nebula's glow filtered through a narrow viewport, bathing the space in a dreamlike haze. Zinnia stood close, her gown's outer layer shed, revealing a silken underdress that clung to her, her lavender skin shimmering like a beacon. She pressed against Elias, her fingers grazing his jaw, a touch that sent a jolt through his body, her breath hot against his skin. "You make me crave chaos," she whispered, her voice a raw confession, her golden eyes burning with a need that mirrored his own, her scent overwhelming his senses. Elias's hand slid to her waist, pulling her flush against him, the heat of her body igniting every nerve. "Crave it, Zinnia," he growled, their lips a breath apart, the air crackling with unspoken desire. "Let's set the galaxy ablaze." Her body swayed into his, her lavender skin glowing, her lips grazing his in a fleeting spark that set his blood alight. The alcove seemed to pulse, the nebula blurring, as their breaths mingled, a moment poised on the edge of surrender. But a klaxon scream shattered the haze, harsh and urgent, a voice blaring through the comms. "Clyro's extremists have breached the station. All hands to defense." Zinnia's eyes flashed, her hand lingering on his chest, a vow etched in her touch. "We'll finish this," she said, her voice a sultry promise, and turned, her underdress catching the nebula's light as she strode toward the chaos. Elias exhaled, his body thrumming, his grin unshakable. "Health of a party," he muttered, eyes tracing her retreating form, the fire in his chest roaring louder than any alarm. The extremists could storm the station. He was ready for a fight, but Zinnia was the war he wanted to win. Elias Kane slid across the station's command deck on his knees, sparks flying as a Clyro's extremist plasma bolt scorched the air where his head had been moments before. The border station was a war zone, its corridors convulsing with the shriek of alarms and the shudder of breached bulkheads. Consoles erupted in fountains of light, their holographic displays fracturing into static as the station's systems screamed in protest. The air was thick with the acrid tang of molten metal and the pulse of adrenaline, every surface vibrating with the chaos of battle. Elias, his leather jacket singed at the shoulder, slammed a fist into a shattered panel, yanking free a bundle of wires that sparked like a dying star. His green eyes glinted with defiance, his jaw set as he twisted the wires into a makeshift device, his fingers moving with the reckless precision of a man who thrived on the edge. "Come on, you beautiful mess," he muttered, his voice a low growl, sweat beading on his brow as the device hummed to life, its glow casting stark shadows across his rugged features. Beyond the deck, Zinnia fought like a tempest incarnate, her lavender skin glistening with sweat, her plasma blade carving arcs of violet fire through the air. Her battle armor, sleek and unyielding, hugged her form, accentuating the fierce grace of her movements. Each swing a dance, each strike a vow. Her raven hair, freed from its bindings, whipped around her face, framing golden eyes that burned with unquenchable resolve. She spun, deflecting a Clyro's blade, her body a blur of power and elegance, the station's flickering lights painting her in hues of silver and flame. "Elias," she called, her voice cutting through the din, sharp and commanding, yet laced with a desperate edge. "The core's locked. We need it now." He glanced up, his grin flashing like a beacon, his shirt clinging to his sweat-slicked chest, outlining the hard planes of muscle beneath. "Working on it, gorgeous," he shouted, his fingers coaxing a final spar from the device, a tangle of wires he'd dubbed pure anarchy. "This baby's gonna sing." A Clyro's extremist lunged, its claws glinting, but Zinnia was there, her blade slicing through the air, sending the attacker sprawling. She grabbed Elias's arm, yanking him toward a maintenance shaft, her touch searing his skin despite the chaos. "Move!" she barked, her lavender skin glowing, her eyes locking onto his with a fierce intimacy that made his pulse thunder. The shaft was a claustrophobic vein of steel, its walls slick with condensation, the air heavy with the hum of failing systems. Their bodies pressed together, her curves molding against his frame, her breath hot against his neck as they crawled toward the core. Elias felt every inch of her strength, her heat, the tremor in her lavender skin, and it took every ounce of focus to keep moving. Her fingers dug into his shoulders, a desperate anchor, her golden eyes blazing in the dim light, reflecting a storm of fear and desire. "You make me want to fight for this," she whispered, her voice raw, each word a confession that echoed in the tight space, her breath stirring the hair at his nape. Elias's hand found her cheek, his thumb tracing the curve of her jaw, feeling the pulse beneath her silken skin. "Then fight, Zinnia," he growled, his lips brushing hers in a fleeting, electric spark that set his nerves alight. "Fight and burn with me." Her eyes flared, her body pressing closer, the shaft's confines amplifying the heat between them, a moment poised on the edge of surrender. But duty called, and they pushed forward, emerging into the core chamber, a cavern of pulsing conduits, its heart a locked crystal matrix. Elias jammed his device into the access port, sparks flying as it whirred, the matrix glowing as the station's defenses roared to life. Alarms fell silent, replaced by the hum of turrets repelling the extremists, the battle turning in their favor. Exhausted, they stumbled to an observation deck, its viewport framing a cosmos ablaze with distant suns, their light bathing the room in a soft, violet haze. Elias leaned against the railing, his shirt torn, revealing the taut lines of his torso, his green eyes softened by fatigue but alive with fire. Zinnia stood close, her armor dented, her lavender skin shimmering, her hair a dark halo around her face. Her golden eyes held his, fierce with emotion, a silent vow etched in their depths. "I'm leaving, Zinnia," Elias said, his voice soft, a rare vulnerability breaking through his bravado. "The galaxy needs more sparks, more chaos." Her lavender hand gripped his, her fingers warm and strong, her eyes glistening with unspoken words. "You've shown me freedom, lies, and fire," she said, her voice breaking, each word a confession that pierced his heart. "In love." She leaned in, her lips pressing against his cheek, a searing promise that burned through him, her scent, star bloom in battle, lingering like a drug. "Stand tall, Elias," she whispered, her breath hot against his skin, "and carry me with you." Elias's grin flashed, a roguish wink masking the ache in his chest. "Always, Starlight," he murmured, his voice a husky vow, his hand brushing hers one last time, memorizing the feel of her. He turned, striding toward the shuttle bay, his boots echoing in the quiet deck, the stars blurring beyond the viewport as he boarded his craft. The engines hummed, the station shrinking to a speck, but the heat of Zinnia's touch clung to him, a fire that would never fade. He leaned back, his grin unshakable, the galaxy sprawling before him like a challenge he was born to meet. Zinnia watched from the deck, her lavender skin glowing in the starlight. a smile curving her lips, soft, defiant, alive. The alliance would carry her mark, forged in battle and tempered by a human's chaos. She pressed a hand to her cheek, where his breath had lingered, and whispered to the void, "Burn bright, Earthman." The stars answered, their light a silent promise, and Zinnia turned, her steps steady, her heart ablaze with a freedom she'd never known. The galaxy had changed, and so had she.